is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 399, and it's side 1, July 27th, 1979. The post office is at it again. They're after my mail. If you write to me, send me letters that are scotch taped maybe across the bottom where their cutter goes, or staple it just at the bottom if you want. I wrote a letter to the editor in the Monterey Herald this last week. I'll just briefly tell you what I stated because I'm really getting tired of this. I said 5 checks were mailed to me last month, all 5 envelopes, and the letters that accompanied the checks were lost by the post office. All I got was the checks, and I think I mentioned this a while back, what was happening. Another letter the next week was opened in error, cut across the bottom, stapled, and sent to the IRS in Fresno, California. That was a personal letter, a dinner invitation. Another letter to a woman in Oregon was mailed in Carmel. It was postmarked San Francisco, and she received it stamped, received without contents. How would they know that there wasn't a letter inside, and it wasn't cut at the bottom, and there was no letter inside, so evidently it was steamed open. 4 weeks later, another letter from Oakland that came to my address, a home address, opened in error, cut in the bottom, and again that staple in the middle. Another person wrote to me from Fresno, California, and he sent it to General Delivery in Carmel, and it was about Mae Brussell and getting the tapes and writing to me. And one of the men at the post office took the letter, and instead of putting it in General Delivery where I pick up mail from radio shows or in my mailbox that I've had many, many years, a postal box that comes to the house, he sent a letter back to the person. The message was for Mae Brussell, writing, "What can I do for you?" And I don't know how many of you get personal letters from postal clerks answering your mail. Just this week, again, I got another letter from Concord, California, opened in error. It had the correct address, the name, address, the correct zip code, and it went to the IRS in Fresno. I was told that the reason one letter went to the IRS was because it had the wrong zip code. Why it should go to the stamped in Fresno, I could see a postal station, but the IRS. But this one is properly addressed, properly zipped. The last one that came this week opened in error, and it went there. After the first letter went to the IRS, I figured that I would probably be ripe for some surveillance and annoyance, or else the people writing to me would be. And sure enough, I got a letter this week, $800 owed on my income tax, which was totally untrue, and I had paid my taxes, and I sent them copies of the canceled checks. But they had 3 different Social Security numbers there, which is really impossible to get. I have the taxes made out by H.L. Block, and the right Social Security number was on the slip that they sent me, and then they had 2 other numbers also. So it couldn't have been that reason that they wrote to me, and it was just for harassment. I had to look up the canceled checks and so forth, but it's to let me know. I'm sure as soon as the mail started going there, I knew the tax people would be hassling me, and I wrote to the newspaper asking, is this some more of the dirty tricks, because I investigate the assassination teams from the Treasury Department, and I'm sure that's what's going on. The Los Angeles Times had an article this week. It wasn't a wire service story, so I don't know if it was picked up in your other papers. The BZ drug tests, according to Los Angeles Times, that were given in the 60s had, in quotes, no lasting effects, the Pentagon said. Then when you read down in the article, further in the article, it says the Defense Department has done no follow-up of those subjected to the test, but contended the studies have shown it only has short-term effects. Now, how can it show it only has short-term effects if they say they did no follow-ups? This is sort of like George Orwell's 1984 or the double talk or double think. If they haven't done the studies, how do they know it has no effects? The Scientologists and the group investigating mind control and Nazis in America, really the strongest and the only group of people working, the American Citizens for Honesty in Government, had a news conference on this, and they've had one particular serviceman who claims that he still has memory lapses, and they've also had another man on Operation Mind Control, I believe the ABC program, a man in France who was given this drug, allegedly LSD, but it has something else in it. It's quinaludinyl, I don't know if I pronounced that right, benzylate. I'll spell it out for you on the printed sheet. And it comes in the form of an LSD tablet, but it's described as the most potent hallucinogen known to man. Incidentally, the CIA and the Pentagon, according to this Los Angeles Times article, have 50 tons of this drug stockpiled. They've managed to stockpile enough to disorient the world's population 10 times over. Some of it is stockpiled at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland, where it was first created. Some more is at the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, where Dr. Lawrence Layton was the head of chemical biological warfare and then moved to Berkeley. It was Dr. Layton's son, Larry Layton, is still down in Georgetown. I haven't seen any trial for the shooting of Representative Leo Ryan or the other people at the airport. Have you? Total silence. He's become a non-person, this Layton boy. After all the furor of the deaths, I haven't read a thing in the newspaper about those trials. Some more of this chemical is at Pine Bluff Arsenal in Arkansas. That's where Martha Mitchell worked when she was friendly with Bebe Rebozo in the early days of her career, and then she went on and married John Mitchell, who became the Attorney General. Air Force enlisted man is being tested, as are other people, as I mentioned, and says that this still has a lasting effect. There was always a problem in our family between my former husband, my first husband, Dr. Marvin Goodwin, over what was administered to our son Marvin in 1967, and I've mentioned this on many tapes. I claimed that Marvin was given this poison, and so did Dr. Eric Byrne, who knew Marvin at the time and lived in Carmel, and Marvin all of a sudden changed his personality and became totally psychotic and freaked out. This alleged LSD that was given to him by Carolyn Gilman, I've mentioned her on tapes. Her husband is Peter Gilman, who wrote Diamond Head. They had direct links to Navy intelligence. A man who tunes our pianos has rented a house from Peter for years and said that he was telephonically in contact with no less than Aristotle Onassis. He was disguised as a hippie during the 60s on the peninsula and came to my home for the purposes, allegedly, of writing a book with me on Kennedy, on the assassination, and my son stayed at their home for a few weeks. And when I was in New Orleans with Jim Garrison, he administered this so-called acid trip. His wife handed Marvin, and two close friends who are still alive, fortunately, were in the house at the time. And Marvin was writing songs for Bobby Darin. He was just in college, UC Santa Cruz, and then he totally flipped out. He still is writing songs, and he's still doing a lot of productive artwork, but about every 16 or 17 months he has a total breakdown and a relapse, not dissimilar to the original attack, but not as violent. And then he has to get medical care or short hospitalization to get himself back on his feet. His father was a pediatrician in Beverly Hills. We always had a disagreement over what this was. Byrne said he had been poisoned, and here were these people with links to the CIA in the house. There I was with Jim Garrison fighting Clayshaw, that element in New Orleans, and Carlos Marcello and the gang just named by the House Select Committee on Assassinations. I was in a can of worms there when they were in my house here. And yet his father and I never could come to an agreement, even though he was a doctor. My first husband, Dr. Marvin Goodwin, passed away this week. He had a fatal stroke, and even though he was a very fine pediatrician, we had 12 years of disagreement. We were close. We were good friends. 12 years disagreement on what it was that happened to Marvin that gives him these setbacks. And we never could agree on that. He never did explore the government connections, and he was willing to just say that Marvin had psychotic seizures and not that he was poisoned. So I always follow with great interest the drug control program because of what happened in our own home. As a matter of fact, a woman in San Francisco called me this week and wanted me to help be at a trial for her. She had called Walter Bollard, who wrote Operation Mind Control. and she wanted me to help with her son, who she said had electrodes implanted in his teeth at the time of some dental work. And Beauart told her to call me. It was quite a compliment. He's in the middle of getting a divorce. Another thing that happened to him and his family, as soon as his book was written and he went on tour, his home was broken up, and we've suffered a lot of different things in common, and so have a lot of the other researchers. But Beauart suggested she get in touch with Mae Brussell, who she said was described by him as the person who knows the most about the mind control in this country. That was a compliment from Beauart. I've spent time with him up in San Francisco when he was there. I couldn't help her because I had to go down to Los Angeles to take care of matters with my sons regarding their father, and it's been a very hard week. It's a hard week because we couldn't ever resolve the differences of opinion on how to handle the problem. And I think this is something that, in the midst of all the research I have here on my desk and table, I have to dwell into a little bit, that while they're very fine people doing research, we won't all agree on how far to go or on what method to do it or what are our priorities. And each of us has a different goal, each has a different way of operating. But it's really a shame, because the sum total of what we're doing, the expense involved, the emotional energy, the machinery of putting material together, requires a support system of other people. It requires using it, getting it to the media, not sitting on it, and you can't get a group of 10 researchers to sit together and decide the priorities 1 to 10 of what should be exposed. That's a tragedy. I could get 10 people from what George Orwell calls the upper class, and all 10 would agree on a given set of candidates, on a Congress, on a speech, on what they want, how they want to control their investments, on how the justice system should work, on the court systems, letting certain people out, locking others up. Crimes are not punished. The guilty get away. They all agree on breaking the rules to hold to what they have, or breaking the rules to get more. There's never been a concerted effort of the medical movement to examine what the government did to people during the war. The American Medical Association and doctors, they don't want to know about the mind control, the medical experimentations, even though they may be treating people today that have been poisoned years ago and they don't know it. The gay community, which is a large political bloc, will not help researchers find out who killed John Kennedy or Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, or hundreds of others. They simply step in, and when somebody like Harvey Milk is murdered, there are demonstrations and anger on the streets, but that's the extent of the political activity. A gentleman by the name of Larry McDonald, a Democrat from Georgia, is now working in Congress to stop the gay rights movement. He's adamant. He works with Dr. Robert Grant from the Christian Voice, and they have stated it's clear that consensual sodomy and other homosexual acts should never be accepted as legitimate, and they want Congress to act on this and stop the gay rights movement. Mr. McDonald has been mentioned by Byron Watson, Robert Byron Watson, as being part of the scheme of assassins that was helped setting up the murder of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King in Marietta, Georgia. And now that the House Select Committee on Assassinations is coming out with their report that there is was probably a plan to pay somebody to kill Martin Luther King. The plan involved James Earl Ray and his brothers and men in St. Louis, Missouri, with contacts right down in Georgia, right in the lap of Larry McDonald territory. If the gay community thinks that they can survive any better than the gays did under Adolf Hitler when they were shipped to the concentration camps, they're wrong. Survival depends upon a healthy electoral system where people who represent the wishes of the masses and the majority are in power. And when those people are murdered and you don't investigate those murders, your rights are sure to be diminished in direct proportion to the amount of space you give the killers and avoid the main problem, which is the diagnosis of the murder situation. And everyone who's interested in surviving this country, who really cares, should get down to the basics of these murders. They're primary because the social effects that branch out later are felt, and nothing can be changed until we solve these murders. Another article this last week, more gunfire on Indian land, Indian reservations in Minnesota, and sending Indians to prison, harassments and convictions going on there. Again, the Indian leaders, Mr. Banks and Mr. Means and Mr. Pelletier, who escaped and was brought back to Lompoc this week, don't address themselves to the killing of people like John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, or Mr. Oaks, the Indian leader, or many of the other Indian leaders. They line up, they use people like Mark Lane as their attorney, yet they don't address themselves at all to the assassinations. And I fail to see how John Connally or George Bush or Ronald Reagan or Howard Baker is going to help Indian affairs. The people that are running for office now, or Jimmy Carter or any of them, are not interested in that, and the closest we ever got to it was when John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy were alive. There seemed to be a chance or a hope that some changes would be made in this country, particularly Robert Kennedy, if he had a chance to become president. There was one article in the paper this week, blacks found to discover cancer later than blacks, and they're not finding out why the mortality rate comes so fast with blacks, 22% higher for blacks than whites for cancer. You remember in 1974 I was writing articles about Dildren in the food programs for blacks. Another point is that they can't get treatment in hospitals, and white people get more expensive, very expensive treatment in the advanced stages, but it's perfectly obvious that black people are, low-income people are not able to nip it. They can't afford the doctor's visits. They can't afford to stay away from the work, and nobody is investigating the possibility of the purposeful poisoning of them in their food that would cause them to have 22% higher cancer rate than whites. Another article about the jobless blacks that was in the paper this week, the unemployment among black teenagers is twice as high as the national figure. The government figure is 36.3% of the blacks from age 16 to 19 are jobless. And there's a report now from the National Urban League that it's really much worse, that 60% were without full-time employment jobs in 1978. Now, 44% of those had a high school education and 15% attended college. And the head of the Urban League said if lack of education and not racial discrimination was the primary factor, then the employment rates for blacks and whites with similar education should be comparable. And there was a warning by a spokesman, Alexander Allen, a member of the National Urban League, that we better look out, that the blacks just might be in trouble. He said black youth today are in deep trouble. But do the blacks ask who killed Malcolm X? The men in jail serving time said that they were paid to do it. Do they ask about Jonestown? Do they care about Medgar Evers, about Martin Luther King? When the House Select Committee said there was a probable assassination to kill Martin Luther King this week, how many people from the black community who have taken that mobile ladder up to the next, from the working class to the lower middle class, gone up that rung of the ladder, how many are going to be behind researchers like myself saying, let's really find out what happened? The black friends that I've had, they are not interested really in my research, except once in a while on occasional radio shows. They're really not concerned who killed any of their leaders, even though there were times at the Watergate exposés, for example, when E. Howard Hunt was talking about for the reasons to kill Fidel Castro, he said you have to kill the leaders because it's easier to take the country. The black people are not together on what is happening. The whites are not together. In New York, they're talking about killer disease feared in New York City. Another article this week, in Jamestown, New York, there's getting samples of Legionnaire's disease in fear of a breakout of Legionnaire's disease in New York and in Wisconsin. Who in the heck believes there even was such a thing as Legionnaire's disease? How do you know what this is, and if there can't be large epidemics or put in air conditioning ducts, again, to test or what are they going to do with those 50 tons of LSD? Incidentally, the LA Times article that I mentioned before says that some of this leaked out of one of the arsenals. They had a leakage, and the people near there got sick from it, from this hallucinogenic drug, and were taken to the hospital and then released. It wasn't serious, but this 50 tons that's disseminated within 3 states can cause a sickness if it leaks. No serious injuries, but 3 workers were exposed. Now, how do you get exposed to this BZ drug if it's in acid? Is it airborne also, that you get exposed to it and then get a temporary sickness and have to go into a hospital? There's a lot of questions to be asked that no doctor, Ralph Nader, the others aren't addressing themselves to. I don't see the articles. I take all these newspapers, I see all the problems. I hardly, never, ever see a spokesman attacking, getting to the root of the problem. Something is vitally wrong, and we have to re-examine our thinking to find out why people simply can't get to the root of the problem. They read that it's happening. They must read the same papers that I'm reading, but there isn't a spokesman for any of these groups trying to solve an overview of what is happening to them as they all sink down lower and people get more sickness, more leaks, more accumulation of weapons, of mind-controlled drugs, and so forth. I don't know where the energy is to combat this out among the masses or among the select few. There's just a very, very few that are even aware of the problems. A few people are disappointed that when I tell them that I'm writing a book on Oswald doubles, they've expressed their disappointment. They wanted me to take on the whole power structure at one time and tell you what happened each year and how it came down, how we got to the brink of this apocalypse. I received a letter from Charles Spears in Texas, who probably is the best student of history that I know, the best documented historian, the most active, really the best activist, along with myself, who is constantly hitting the media and persons in the media and in public life with various pieces of information, a real fighter. And he wrote to me, and I just want to read this to you because it's an example of some of the divisiveness that people do have among each other. He said, what I want isn't about how many doubles Oswald had, but rather tie the whole unbelievable era, 1959 to 79 or 1919 to 79. There are so many angles, so many important matters that should not be left out of the total picture. I don't know anyone but Mae Brussell, he wrote to me, who has the total knowledge and capability to do it. I was disappointed to find out that's not what you are about. Now, this again has to do with communication. This is why I want to share it with all of you, because if it's a communication between 2 people moving in the same place, it has to be a question of communication with a large number. When Charles writes, what I want isn't how many doubles. I wanted to find out, and I was disappointed that you weren't doing the total thing. I think it is a better view to say, why specifically did you choose the doubles? And then I can give you a reason. If I've done 15 years' work of research, if I've accumulated this mass library with 3 rooms flowing with files and so forth, and books and articles, I can't even list them. They come in so fast. The real question isn't what you expect of me, what you want from me, or that you should be disappointed in my choice. It really should be, why are you doing it? Maybe if I understand that better, maybe we can both take the same trip to the same place easier than what your expectations are of me. I built my reputation up for collecting this material. That's a big job to put on somebody's shoulders. I hope you have trust in me that the effort that I'm making to accumulate the material for the one book is important. Why am I not writing a whole expose to hit the power structure at one time and pinpoint them to these dates? Well, first of all, I don't have the time or money to take that job right now. That would be about my 4th book. I have the books here, and I have the filing cabinets, I have the articles, but I need many, many more drawers. I need, the material has to be filed and cross-filed to get the book right. I need a staff of 2 or 3 people, and I need at least 12 or 14 more filing cabinets to just line everything up in chronological order, because that's the way I think, and that's the way I do it. And you need time and space and money to tackle that job. I can put it in simplistic terms, the way the system works, but it would take more. It would take an advance from a publisher, which I'm not asking for, and it requires a bigger application for a whole series like a Will Durant type of operation from 1919 to the present date. Secondly, I want my first book to be a good book. I want it to be saying many things at the same time, and I want them loud and clear. A lot of newspaper articles are coming out because the House Select Committee is issuing their second Warren Report. I want to show that what the first Warren Report did was to purposely work in collusion with the assassins, that it didn't have new information that came out later that they didn't have access to. They weren't working in the dark with a few documents from the CIA, such as the fact that the CIA was planning to kill Fidel Castro, and therefore they couldn't get the motives that maybe the Castro Cubans came in and so forth, or that the organized crime worked with the CIA. They knew that all along. I want to show the way the authors of the Warren Commission and this new book have come out, for specifically the Warren Commission, abused disinformation. I want to show how vital evidence was destroyed the first time. I want to show how primary witnesses started to be murdered and are still being murdered. I want to show in this book the way patsies are created and the way agents get away. It isn't an outdated book. It's something that is happening all the time. The U.S. News and World Report has a story on the House Select Committee's discoveries this week. It's dated July 30th, 1979. One more theory on the Kennedy murder. And it says, the committee shows evidence that Oswald and his slayer, Jack Ruby, had connections with organized crime figures and anti-Castro Cubans. And U.S. News and World Report wants to put Lee Harvey Oswald and Marguerite Oswald down with the Jack Ruby milieu. Now, I have to ask this question. When you read that in the New York Times or in the New Report or the U.S. News World Report or Jack Anderson, that Oswald had connections with organized crime and anti-Castro Cubans, before you use the word Oswald, you have to say, well, which Oswald was it? Which Lee Harvey Oswald? Was it the 5'9" in New Orleans that had a stubby beard and a gruffy, dirty outfit, or was it the 5'11" who was bright and educated, who was one of the finest people in radar scanning in the Marines, who was in Navy intelligence, who worked with the CIA and the Soviet Union, who was at home at night with his wife and daughter? His wife was pregnant with a second child. Which one are you talking about? If you don't start by delineating Oswald in capital letters or Oswald with a quotation mark, one being the Lee Harvey Oswald, the son of Marguerite, the 5'11", who was in the Marines, who was at the U-2 bases, who was with Priscilla Johnson in the Soviet Union, and Mr. Schneider and McVicker of the CIA in the Soviet Union, and Eileen Mosby in the CIA, and with the CIA defector from Rand Corporation, Mr. Webster. If you're not talking about the super spy, Oswald, if you don't delineate 5'11" from that grumpy guy that worked with David Ferry and Clay Shaw in New Orleans, then this is the starting point. That is why my reason, I don't have to defend myself, but I only bring it up because the effect of non-communication or expectations about what I should do then disappoints people instead of trying to understand why I'm doing it. When you read about Oswald being in the club of Jack Ruby and linking Oswald the communist to Rubinstein, the Jew, when you read the various people saying he was in that club, which one are you talking about? It makes all the difference in the world. One is going to be a patsy and killed. One is going to make a getaway, and you have to delineate. You have to make it loud and clear who they are speaking about. On the other side of this tape, I'm going into a brief biography from the Warren Commission hearings about Curtis LaVerne Crafard, who worked in the nightclub of Jack Ruby, who saw Lee Harvey Oswald in the club. And why it's so important to say, was this one setting up the cover story? Because right now, you know the triangle I gave you, past listeners, on the expose of the Warren Commission hearings. Another layer of cover-up was maybe the anti-Castro Cubans and organized crime. If you want to get to Reinhard Gehlen and the Nazi operations, if you want to expose the real assassins, you have to knock out the patsies, the subterfuges, the phonies. And the only way you can do that is to separate which Oswald they're talking about and get on to which one was in the intelligence system and which one was set up in an event that the pieces fell apart, that they could keep linking organized crime or maybe a branch of the anti-Castro Cubans, and keep it away from those people in Washington who planned the assassinations, who still plan the assassinations, and will keep murdering as they tighten their power. I want to share with you just a quick rundown of one character that is involved in the Doubles book to show you why I think. But 1 month before his testimony was taken, there was a memo from Mr. Griffin, Bert W. Griffin, a legal assistant for the Warren Commission, that he sent to Leon Hubert, who also was in the room taking testimony a month later. Griffin and Hubert sent a memo dated March the 10th, 1964, that they should examine Curtis LaVerne Crafard, who worked for Jack Ruby, because, in quotes, he closely resembled Lee Harvey Oswald. I think it's interesting that the Warren Commission had an employee working for Jack Ruby that resembled Oswald, because some people had said that Lee Harvey Oswald was seen in the club of Jack Ruby. But yet this man lived there and did odd jobs and also could be dressed working around there in the evening or sitting at a table and be mistaken for Lee Harvey Oswald. Well, Larry Crawford was called, and I just want to give you a real quick essence of his testimony about his background to show you the kind of character that could have been the Oswald that was in the club with Jack Ruby, and certainly has very suspicious background going back to his total life story, which I think is very interesting, that he should just end up at that particular time in history at the club of Jack Ruby, who's to kill Lee Harvey Oswald, and then Crawford left the next day and went on up to Michigan, and only by a fluke was the FBI able to find him, because a letter addressed to him from his sister in Michigan was still in the club among some possessions after Lee Harvey Oswald was killed, and they went right up there and were able to find him. Larry Crawford was, at the time he was interviewed, was unemployed. He described one brother. He has a brother who's in the Army. This is in 1964, in Los Angeles in the Missile Corps, working in anti-aircraft. He himself enlisted in the U.S. Army September 18, 1958 in anti-aircraft and was at Fort Ord, California. He was discharged in November 1959, 13 months after his enlistment, and they asked for his forms, his Defense Department DD-214 Form 14, because he enlisted for 3 to 4 years. He was in 13 months and got an honorable discharge. If you read Philip Agee's book, Inside the Company, they said that many CIA people were given a military service and sent to an Army base as a cover and then put in the CIA, so that Curtis LaVerne Crafard was actually in the military, signed up for a long enlistment, and has discharge papers and was out within 13 months. When he left Fort Ord, he went to the Presidio U.S. Air Defense School up in San Francisco. Of course, Lee Harvey Oswald was working in anti-aircraft also in Marines down at El Toro about this time in 1958. He came home from Japan. And then Crawford went to Germany, and he was over there in April 59. He was transferred over there to D Battery, 2nd Missile Battalion, and he stayed there until November 59. Lee Harvey Oswald got out of the service in September 59 and was in France and went to England and entered Moscow by November 59, so that their lives just coincidentally with anti-aircraft or so forth in California military, one in the Marines and one in the Army, were in California. And then Curtis LaVerne Crafard is in Germany working with anti-aircraft, and he's in Europe at the time. Lee Harvey Oswald arrives in Le Havre, France, and then there is no place or person that sees him in England or Finland until he arrives at the Soviet Union in Moscow. He's in the American Embassy in Moscow. Larry Crawford gave the members of the Warren Commission his discharge papers, and they thought that was agreed that was a really strange 13-month discharge, but didn't go into it. And then they went into his career that caused him, after his discharge from the service, to end up in the nightclub of Jack Ruby. He cut pulpwood up in the Northwest for 7 months. He was in the fruit picking industry. He said the fruit industry in California. He was in that 1 month. He then went from California up to Michigan, and then he went from Michigan to Dallas, Oregon. Dallas, Oregon. And he left Oregon in '61 and joined a carnival in California called the Royal West Golden Gate in Oroville, California, where he was for 4 weeks. Then he went down to Georgia, of course, Atlanta, Georgia, and that Watson information that he's given. He wasn't allowed to testify before the House Select Committee. They interviewed Robert Byron Watson on the assassination teams headquartered in Marietta, Georgia, and Atlanta, Georgia, and he was confident that Mark Lane and Dick Gregory and the House Select Committee would get him to testify, and he couldn't. But we have this Larry Crawford down in Georgia where he went to another carnival, the Jerry Lepka 10-in-1 carnival, and he stayed a week. Then he went up to Detroit, Michigan, and these cities are interesting because overlapping always. Detroit, Michigan, the Ford Motor Company, Gerald Ford, and the Michigan connections, the Georgia connections, the Detroit, come out so much in this assassination, the Houston, Texas, and the Dallas connections. But just coincidentally, let's write it off coincidentally, here he's up in Detroit, Michigan, and he's with the Kitty Carnival, he says, for 2 weeks, back to Dallas, Oregon, Larry Crawford, and then he goes from the Kitty Carnivals and Georgia and Michigan, the same man who was at Jack Ruby's nightclub that resembled Lee Harvey Oswald, and he ends up working for Federal Aviation, hired in Los Angeles through the Los Angeles office, but he's located in Nevada. And again, the Nevada connections to this are tremendous. But he's working for Federal Aviation out of Nevada, and he's a surveyor's assistant. There's no question about where he gets his background, where he was trained to be hired for Federal Aviation. According to all purposes, he's been nothing but managing the sword box, the ladder of swords, the fire eaters, the two-headed baby shows, the snake and the girly shows. But he seems to go from these travels from Detroit, Michigan, Georgia, up to Oregon again, Los Angeles, and then Federal Aviation, and he's in Nevada as a surveyor's assistant. Then Larry Crawford goes to Berkeley, California. But he doesn't remember that he does it. There's a profile on him that the Warren Commission has, and they remind him, were you in Berkeley, California working for Stuart Hill? And they're specific, the address, 1052 Dwight Way in Berkeley, California. And Larry Crawford says, I don't remember. I've forgotten. I had worked for them. I don't remember it. But those were the years, in 1957, 58, and 59, when Candy Jones, who also worked for the same agency as Gerald Ford in New York City, was sent to California, and she was sent to Oakland, California, which is just about 20 miles or right next to Berkeley, where her mind was raced, and she was given double personalities, and the CIA was using that as a space for mind control agents and CIA agents to go out around the world. And Larry Crawford went from Federal Aviation in Nevada to Berkeley, which the Warren Commission knew about, but which his memory is gone. And they told him he worked from July to October in Federal Aviation, and then they changed the subject. And because he can't remember what he did in Berkeley at this company or what it was, his memory is gone, and the Warren Commission, of course, can't remind him of what he did out there. And from that time, Candy Jones said, you can be telephonically controlled by anybody. Once you get the injections in you and they create these double personalities, you can pick up a phone and be anywhere, as she was in Southeast Asia, or with Jimmy Hoffa, or being told to commit suicide down in the Bahamas. He was in Berkeley, and then he was out in Nevada. And then he goes from Berkeley, California, to Dallas, Texas, to a plating company in Dallas, Texas, where he worked for 2 or 3 weeks. Then back up to a tannery in Oregon, and he worked for a Mr. J.D. Tracy, and then a poultry company in Dallas, Texas. And he meets somebody, or he wants to get in touch with a woman from Dallas, Texas, and he can't find her. So he testifies that he went to Las Vegas to try and find the woman he wanted to meet in Dallas, Texas. And that's interesting, because there often is a woman in control of these men that is assigned to them. And there's a woman he wants whose family's in Dallas. He eventually marries her, but he has to go to Las Vegas to locate this woman, and then he spends some time hanging chickens on a chicken rag in Dallas, Texas. In March of '63, he's there. He goes then up to Port Angeles in Washington. This reminds me of James Earl Ray, the chronology I've done, and those of you who don't have it can get a tape of it. This multi-traveling of somebody, and he's always questioned about his money. He has $6 or $7 or $10. But this time he's at Port Angeles. That's just at the tip of Washington before you cross over to Victoria in the summer of '63 in June. We're getting closer to the Kennedy assassination. And then he goes down to California, works for a carnival. His wife, meanwhile, that he wanted to find in Dallas, that he found when he got to Las Vegas, the right connections, has left him and is moving in with his brother, who's still in the Los Angeles area in Army missile work. Now, I don't know who in the Army, where the Army basis for Army missile work is, or whether he works for the Hughes Corporation or Aerospace or Lockheed, because Larry Crawford's brother is working in Army missile in Los Angeles, I guess at the time, even up through the assassination and when he was called as a witness. And this wife that he has now is staying with this brother who does the Army missile work. He goes to some man and raises strawberries and stays there 1 week. He goes back to Michigan to the Happy Land amusement farm for 3 weeks, and then we're warming up closer to the assassination time, where history just finds him in the club of Jack Ruby answering all the phone calls 3 weeks prior to the assassination of John Kennedy. He goes to the Happy Land amusement park from Michigan for 3 weeks down to Memphis, Tennessee. Of course, Memphis played a big part in the Kennedy assassination, the Albert Osborne connections. Osborne with a Lee Harvey Oswald on the bus going to Mexico, while another Oswald 100 miles south is entering Mexico, and two Oswalds are going to leave at the same time. He works at a Memphis fair where he meets a man named Leonard Wood, who it's a German company who owns a form of ride made in Germany, specifically a German company, and he stays with that person. Then he goes to Dallas. Now, they ask him a question which is pertinent because he's been hitchhiking all over the country. Did you hitchhike to Dallas, Texas in the fall of '63? And he said no, that he had seen a man prior, a Mickey Corday. He called him a contact with Mickey Spillane. His name was Mickey Corday. I heard of him prior to this time. It wasn't a hitchhike to Dallas, Texas. I met him, and I went with him to the fairgrounds in Dallas, Texas. From Memphis, Tennessee, he drove straight to Dallas, Texas. And when he gets to Dallas, Texas, he meets Jack Ruby. And he's very explicit that it was not by chance that he ended up in Dallas, Texas, that a particular person took him. So you have this mysterious man from the Defense Department with his 13 months in service and a discharge, honorable discharge after being enlisted, working for Federal Aviation, contacts in Nevada, Detroit, Michigan, the wife from Texas, located in Berkeley for months that he can't account for and has no memory, but they know he's been there. The exact times that Candy Jones is with his Gilbert Jensen in those Oakland offices, just miles away. He's an Oswald look-alike. The Warren Commission knew it. They never investigated the Michigan, the Nevada, the Memphis. the California or the military connections. And he falls right into the lap of Jack Ruby, nor do they ever go into the connections of a Lee Harvey Oswald in Europe in the fall of '69, who is going from France into Moscow, and this man just coincidentally is there. So he ends up right in the lap of Jack Ruby. He meets him the third day at the Texas Fair. There's a summer fair, and he's going to meet Jack Ruby, and he's working the exhibit for this man named Craven, and the Craven Miles exhibit, and that is also the Jack Ruby exhibit. Jack is familiar with Mr. Craven and Mr. Miles, and he has his twist boards. I once did a tape on Jack Ruby and the twist boards, the dummy front, and the oil people, and the Warren Commission sending a memo that could be a dummy front, and the links of that to Mr. Gregory and Marina Oswald. I won't repeat that. You can look on the list and get the tape on the Jack Ruby twist board. He ends up at that fair, and he meets Jack Ruby in Dallas, Texas, and he's in the nightclub for 3 weeks. His job there is very strange. He's at the Carousel Club. He sleeps there. According to his testimony, he has no salary. When he works for Jack Ruby, he has no overt salary at any time, really, except pennies, even though he has a wife and several children by now that are farmed out to various places. Another man, Andrew Armstrong, is with a strange background, but not involved in the double story, is at the Ruby Club also. I'm going into length about Larry Crawford because he was a dead ringer, look-alike of Lee Harvey Oswald, and he was in the club working for Ruby. He had no job, and also his job was to answer the telephones. It was a job without salary of a full-grown adult man staying on until November 23rd, the day after John Kennedy left, at which time he leaves. As a matter of fact, Jack Ruby told him after Kennedy was killed that same day, "You better leave town." They don't explain why, but he told him to get out of town and that he should get on his way. He stayed with Jack Ruby and photographed the posters about Earl Warren and charging him with treason that were paid by the Birch Society at the time of the assassination. And he was with Ruby in the early hours of November 23rd, early morning hours, with a camera, and then he fled and got out of town. A man that was hired for Jack Ruby at the same time, Billy Del Mar. Bill Del Mar was a hypnotist, and he was there, and he also knew Larry Crawford. Crawford didn't eat his meals at the club. He ate at the Eat Well Cafe. That's where Officer Tippit used to eat. That's where Helen Markham was known to eat. The witness to the Tippit killing, that's where the Lee Harvey Oswald, or the Oswald double, which I'll delineate in the book, observed Officer Tippit having breakfast just days before the assassination. Eat Wells was a joint of Jack Ruby's and Larry Crafard, Officer Tippit, and Lee Harvey Oswald and Helen Markham. Mr. Hubert of the Warren Commission asked Larry Crafard, "Do you think it was an act of kindness on the part of Jack Ruby to take you in?" And Crafard said, "I think he was doing me a favor. Still, in all, he was getting some pretty cheap work and labor." He said that 3 to 4 weeks before the assassination, they heard that Kennedy was coming to Dallas. He was working for Jack Ruby at the time, and it was just before the assassination that the proposed route was printed in the newspaper. With regards to where Larry Crafard was at the time of the assassination, he said that he was sleeping at the club that morning, that he overslept when John Kennedy came to town. Now, several parties called the club, and he was asleep. He didn't hear the phone. They asked him if it was in the next room, and he said yes. Did he usually hear it? Yes. Would he wake up if he heard it? Yes. Does he usually get up before 12:30 at noon? Usually, but he was awakened, and Jack came in around 2 to 2:30 and seemed very nervous. He didn't answer the phone. He could hear the phone. He usually answered the phone. Where was Larry Crafard? Was he asleep? There's no way to prove that he was even asleep at this time. But I think the important thing was that he could be dressed up and sitting at tables and could be an Oswald double close enough so that if people wanted to link Jack Ruby to Lee Harvey Oswald and tie in, which was done by the Birch Society and the far right wing And the gang from Georgia that worked with General Walker and the American Opinion publications right after the assassinations, and up to this day kept calling Jack Rubenstein and Oswald the communists to make a Jewish communist link to this conspiracy. They could put someone who was a dead ringer, linked to the military, working there just 3 weeks prior to the assassination, have a sleeper like James Earl Ray, who did absolutely nothing from the time he left St. Louis, Missouri jail until he was in the rooming house behind where Martin Luther King was killed. He simply traveled, danced, took bartending lessons, and had his nose fixed. He just did literally nothing with no money, just pennies handed out until he was strategically placed and could be the fall guy for that assassination. And it seems when Larry Crafard got out of the Army, they could test him for mind control, memory, and so forth, but a dead look-alike was right in that club. And if the look-alikes were planted as early as 1960, which I believe they were, and I think the machinery went in as soon as John Kennedy won the nomination from the Democrats to run against Richard Nixon, the selected man they wanted as president, that the contingencies were there to set up the assassination pattern syndrome and start it rolling. Right after the assassination, the next day, he got up at 11:15 in the morning, and he took off to Michigan. He didn't leave a note. He left the keys to the Jack Ruby's Club with a garage man, and he met a man who had seen him at the fair, at that county fair, who picked him up. He said he didn't arrange it. He recognized me. He didn't know who his name was, but he had a list. He had a lift and a map. They consulted a map, and he knew the way to go, just as James Earl Ray knew the way to go out of St. Louis. He got to Chicago, and then he went on to Michigan. He left in a hurry, and it was only because the letters, I say, from his sister was at the club that they were able to trace him. But tracing him is one thing. The necessity for creating, the expense of using these sleepers, such as James Earl Ray, the months, the expense of creating the doubles for them, that the government has, the wasted energy, the wasted lives, the location of Crafard, looking back into his non-memory time in Berkeley. When I read this a long time ago and cross-filed this material of the Warren Commission hearings, we didn't think of Berkeley, California, and lack of memory as a place for mind control or brainwashing, or one of the many places. But I go into this now because that is the reason, not that I have to defend myself or explain to anybody why I'm working on the doubles of Lee Harvey Oswald. The whole world doesn't topple down after you explain the massive overlay of the corruption. You know, termites can do just as good a job in breaking a house down as a bomb falling from the roof. The chances of dwellings collapsing or being eaten away by termites is even greater than a Skylab falling on you. And I don't see any reason why, with the massive amount of work I've done that can be so heavily documented, to take as a first book a swap at every institution and every public official and every meeting they had and talk about their collusion. I prefer to do 5 or 6 books, maybe one a year, heavily documented, a slow way. It's slow, but it's sure, and it will last. And then maybe, you know, if I get this book completed and out, when you hear the word doubles, or when you read the newspaper after these tragedies and you see these people giving information to news people, maybe people will become more skeptical, more analytical. They won't trust the media for what they see, these human interest stories. Oh, I saw him at the rifle range. He was a good shooter. I saw the Carcano. It can shoot accurately at a fast speed. I heard him talking about communism. I heard him putting down the Marines. All of these people weren't talking about the 5/11, the real Oswald. They were talking about a man who was providing the media with the instant stories. And once that was set in people's minds, it was locked. It can't be unlocked. So if you don't delineate who these people are, Oswald, the 5/11, the Marines, the intelligent, educated, skilled, sophisticated, or the 5/9, the gruffy, provocateur, and the 2 or 3 or 4 people impersonating him over and over again, and the fact that the Commission knew it. You see, the Commission knew in March that Larry Crafard was a look-alike, and there isn't anything in their 102
pages of testimony that indicates that they did a thing about it. And I think it's a symptom of a problem, and that is why I'm taking this route. And I think you'll like the end product, and if it's solid and secure, I can build other blocks like you build a pyramid. You don't start at the top and look down. You have some solid blocks, and you build a base. And as far as you go along, that base is solid, and that's the way I prefer to work, and that's why I'm working on the doubles.
Now to another subject. There was a meeting of the military junta right here in the Monterey Peninsula this week. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, former NATO commander Alexander Haig, West German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, who recently resigned or is out of office now, Mr. Bechtel from Bechtel Corporation, and David Packard from Hewlett-Packard Company. Stephen Bechtel Jr. was the host of the gathering at the residence. They flew in to visit and socialize and do a little yachting out in the harbor, and Mr. Schmidt also wanted to visit the 10-day Bach Festival. It's been going on for 10 days. It's an annual musical festival. He was here in 1976, and was back here to attend the Bach Festival this year. They sailed out in the harbor and talked about the 1980 Moscow Olympics, the Trans-Pacific races, and so forth. They went to hear performances by Bach, Haydn, and Mozart. East German artists were there. There was a harpsichordist and violinist from Germany, and they attended these concerts at the Carmel Bach Festival. All very innocent sports for men on vacation. Haig kissing her, Hewlett-Packard's director, Mr. Packard, Mr. Bechtel, and Henry Kissinger. Reminds me of the book I've quoted before, The Nazis Go Underground, by Kurt Reese. This was put out in the 40s, 1943, and it tells how the Nazis were reorganizing their plans to take over the world. It says that Himmler divided various agencies into two parts. This is when they realized that the war would have to wind down and they were losing it. They couldn't take Russia, the Soviet Union, so they would retrench for World War III. They would divide various agencies into two parts and have cell systems where the A man contacted the upper group in espionage and the B man worked with the underground. And they would give agencies different names to take the place of what they were before. The Minister of Foreign Affairs became the Culture Department. The Minister of Interior in Nazi Germany became the Department of Health. And in the Minister of Culture that was to take over, the Nazis would use this entire ministry, they said, for their underground. And it won't look like a Nazi operation. It said the propaganda ministry will have to be sacrificed. That was Goebbels' great minister of propaganda. But we'll put it under the Minister of Culture in the spirit of Goethe and Bach and Beethoven. And they must not be disturbed to re-educate the Germans. The Ministry of Culture will function as a contact between the Nazi underground and certain industrialists, and will be properly used for this purpose under the different departments of the Technical Institute and seismology and so forth. This book on the Nazis going underground said it may seem strange that such departments should exist within the framework of the Minister of Culture, but they do. And they have precious little to do with Goethe, Bach, or Beethoven. They furnish the ideal contact between the Nazis and industry. The Minister of Culture will supervise and create a number of cultural clubs all over Germany that are excellently suited as fronts for the Nazis. And of course, we know that they're not just in Germany, and I'm very suspicious. It's nice for the old boys to get together, but when you get these names of Mr. Schultz, George Schultz, and Mr. Bechtel, Stephen Bechtel Jr., the industrialist who's building up all of Saudi Arabia. He's the man behind the contracts for all of the strong Arab nations. And people tell me or ask, why is Henry Kissinger believed by you to not be a Jew? I'm telling you, when Henry Kissinger sits with Alexander Haig and Chancellor Helmut Schmidt and Mr. Schultz and David Packard and Stephen Bechtel Jr., believe me, the Henry Kissinger there is
the Nazi that went underground, exactly the years that they were talking about here, and the corporate heads were meeting in Monterey and Carmel, California. Now, they're getting ready for the Reagan Kitchen Cabinet that is headquartered in Palo Alto in the Hoover Library. These will be the men behind the war machine, the COINTEL operations. These are the powers, the Haig, the Kissinger, and the people whose names I've read off there. Mr. Schmidt is not a deposed person from Germany. He speaks and represents the West German government and all this activity. There's another article, Recession Map of the Effects of the Recession in the United States. In our Pacific area, it says, will not be affected this year because of the strength and diversity of its economy. And then you read the MX missile project in Los Angeles will provide 130,000 new jobs. California will create 46,000 new jobs from the $8.5 billion in the state's economy from this missile project. It's a tragedy that so much in California is dependent upon the missile contracts, upon these warheads, this war machine, the aerospace industry. Don't forget Nixon was their selected candidate. Reagan is their selected candidate. And meanwhile, while you're having a nice summer vacation and we can't agree upon our strategy, I'll bet you anything, all 5 or 6 of those men, if you can call them men, sat down and agreed about everything they wanted to do. That is the tragedy. They could get together. We couldn't get 6 researchers to sit together, but I'll bet you on that yacht when they went out to the harbor or to the Bach Festival, they really got together on what they were going to do to us. And now we have to sit and wait or do something about it, and I guess that's up to each of us. Take care. Our time is out again. I'll be with you next week. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel.